1997 would be a year in which Star Wars titles expand into genres the series is not traditionally familiar with, starting with Star Wars Yoda Stories, released in March of that year. The game, set in between the events of Empire and Jedi, is a collection of games moulded in an RPG-like setting in which the player has to complete objectives like rescuing friends, obtaining objects, or performing quests for various NPCs. The game features somewhat random generation, with the order of missions and other details being slightly different each time. However, the goals and the missions themselves stay the same. The game was intended not to be a full game, but a simple desktop replacement to other coffee break games such as Solitaire or Minesweeper, and in this regard it can be somewhat fulfilling. Most outlets conversely decided to review it as a traditional game, and in this sense it did not do well, featuring only very simple gameplay and graphics. The story isn't over there though, as 2 years later a version for the Game Boy Color would be released. With the graphics being slightly less colourful and the gameplay more restricted than the already lacklustre original, it was cited by many publications of the time, such as GameSpot, as being the worst Star Wars game ever produced, and many fans have a hard time disagreeing with them. In April of that year, fans would get the sequel for the XWing series they had been looking forward to for almost 2 years, XWing vs TIE Fighter. It was the most graphically capable game of the series so far, featuring high resolutions, texture mapping, and a completely rewritten game engine. Despite this, it was not the sequel many fans hoped for. XWing vs TIE Fighter ditched the story-driven campaigns of the previous games to focus almost entirely on multiplayer action, leading some fans to disregard it as part of the series and almost view it as a spin-off. Some of these complaints were dealt with in the expansion pack released in November of 1997, Balance of Power. The original game was expanded with 2 full campaigns of 15 missions each, many more fighter types that were missing from the original, and some fixes to the stability issues that many fans complained about. Despite the original release being somewhat half-baked, XVT was a clear progression for the series in terms of technology, and coupled with the expansion, it is a great addition to the series in its own right, with many holding up the simulation physics as being some of the best ever seen in the series.
Why hesitate? Strike me down.
In time, Ron. First, I need something from you.
September of 1997 would see players return to the shoes of one of the most popular Star Wars Expanded Universe characters, Kyle Katarn, in the sequel to 95's Dark Forces. Jedi Knight is one of the most highly regarded Star Wars titles of all time, and for good reason. The story follows Katarn as he attempts to track down a dark Jedi that killed his father, leading Katarn on a journey of discovering the Force, battling the remnants of the Empire, and becoming wound into the Rebel Alliance further. The gameplay also featured large improvements. An enhanced engine with increased graphical capabilities made the game look nice for the time, and the inclusion of Force powers and lightsaber combat was highly celebrated by fans and critics alike. Knight also featured a primitive morality system, with 2 different endings based on your choice of light or dark Force powers throughout the game. Knight was also the first in the series to offer multiplayer, a component that has become synonymous with the series, known for having one of the most ardent and loyal fan communities of any online game. Jedi Knight was a hit, impressing everyone that played it, though it did not escape criticism for its performance on low-end systems, some of the level layouts, and the perceived cheesiness of a few of the cutscenes. Despite this, it holds a place in many gamers' hearts to this day. The following year, an expansion would be released, Mysteries of the Sith. Expanding on the original with a new campaign set 5 years after the original, you followed Mara Jade on her quest as an apprentice to Katarn. Mysteries changed some things from the original, now using 3D cutscenes instead of the FMV ones from the original. Mysteries also greatly increased the multiplayer capabilities, including new modes and a large amount of maps. Mysteries was received somewhat more mixed than Knight, with criticism placed on uneven pacing in the story and some other minor faults. However, fans loved it, and it has come to be seen as a worthy expansion to one of the greatest Star Wars games of all time. Released in October was a PC version of Monopoly based around Star Wars characters. Proving that the series could be applied to virtually anything, The game was essentially Monopoly featuring a Star Wars makeover, meaning that a lot of the sounds, music and scenes of the movies are incorporated in some fashion. Gamers saw it as mostly a novelty piece of software, an example of the huge merchandising of the series rather than a serious attempt to entertain. However, it was nevertheless another well-made and well-presented product. The final Star Wars game of 1997 is also one of the most infamous, Masters of Teräs Käsi on the PlayStation 1. Stepping away from the action genre the series is known for, Teräs Käsi is a one-on-one fighting game in the vein of Tekken or Virtua Fighter, featuring various Star Wars characters and locations. Poorly received, the game is criticised on all levels. Poor controls, shoddy hit detection and an even more pointless story added to the list of problems that gamers would find. A large complaint is that lightsabers simply bounce off opponents instead of slicing them apart, weakening the impact the deadly weapons are supposed to have. Gamers were confused that LucasArts chose to go down a Tekken style of fighting route rather than attempting to make a dueling game such as Soul Calibur, and has been held in contempt ever since. "1998 continued 97's expansion into new genres with Star Wars Rebellion, the series' first serious foray into the real-time strategy genre. Usually classified as a 4X game in a similar vein to Master of Orion, Rebellion charged the player with manufacturing facilities, managing resources and military, and assigning units around the systems. Playing as either the Galactic Empire or the Rebel Alliance, the player can engage in diplomacy, colonise, command fleets, as well as a host of other things. Despite the apparent complexity, the game received a mediocre reception, with complaints being levelled around the emphasis on space battles and the poor user interface. GameSpot went further, claiming that it was a sloppy game bearing all the hallmarks of being shoved out the door half finished. Many gamers agreed, but the power of the Star Wars fandom meant that many fans produced their own mods to improve the game, and it managed to garner a strong community despite the critical panning the title received. Star Wars would make its long-awaited return to the arcade in 1998 with one of the most beloved Star Wars games of all time, Star Wars Trilogy Arcade. Released in conjunction with the special edition re-releases of the movies in theatres, the game was a 3D rail shooter by Sega, following several key battles from the series. Experienced in both the stand-up and sit-down cabinet, the player went through various scenarios in flight and foot, such as the battle on Hoth and Endor, as well as the Death Star run. There were also special missions where you could, for one of the first times, hold the joystick in your hand and wield it as a lightsaber directly, fulfilling a fantasy gamers and fans alike have had for years. Even today, the machine is a staple in many arcades across the world and was a solid entry in an already excellent series of arcade titles. By 1998, hype and hysteria for the upcoming Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, scheduled for release in 1999, was at fever pitch. Many multimedia pieces of software were released to take advantage of this, with Star Wars Behind the Magic being a prime example. The software was mostly an in-depth look at the original trilogy, featuring scripts, details, glossaries, making-ofs, and a few mini-games. A highlight for many fans was the inclusion of deleted scenes for some of the first time in a widely released form, as well as alternate rough footage versions of various scenes from the movie. To add to this, a preview for Episode 1 was included, making these discs a must-have repository for many superfans of the day.
You can feel the power of the Force on your PC like never before. The Star Wars Millennium Falcon CDrom Playset. It's a whole new way to control the action. The fate of the galaxy is in your hands.
Fire!
And it all comes to life.
Yes!
With scenes from the Star Wars trilogy.
Come on, Chewie, get us out of here! Jump into hyperspace!
The Star Wars Millennium Falcon CD-ROM playset. The galaxy will never be the same.
Whoa!
Comes with CD playset and Han Solo figure. All other figures each sold separately. Requires Windows 95 or higher.
Though the series appeals to all ages, much of Star Wars merchandising is aimed squarely at children, and video games are no exception. In 1998, Hasbro released the Millennium Falcon CD-ROM playset, in which players could fumble through an FMV game utilising hidden object style gameplay and QuickTime events, using the Millennium Falcon as a controller. It has largely been forgotten to time as the 90s novelty toy, and by all accounts, that's for the best. Keeping in line with their approach of appealing to children as well as teens, Star Wars Droid Works was one of the series' first attempts at an edutainment game by studio Lucas Learning that would go on to create many more games in this genre. Built in the Sith engine that was used to make Dark Forces 2, DroidWorks challenged the player with assembling their own droid using many different parts and combinations in order to complete certain missions, teaching the player about machines, energy, force, and other physics related ideas. Compared to other edutainment titles of the time, DroidWorks was far more complete, utilising enjoyable droid building gameplay with increasingly challenging puzzles and competent graphics for the time. It appealed to gamers far outside the intended audience. The final Star Wars game of 1998 was to become one of the most recognised and spawn a beloved series, Star Wars Rogue Squadron, on the PC and Nintendo 64. Rogue Squadron is an arcade-style action game designed to appeal to a different set of gamers than the earlier X-Wing flight sims. Inspired by the comic series of the same name, the player controls Luke Skywalker and his Rogue Squadron of X-Wing pilots as they take the battle to the Empire in between the events of episodes 4 and 5. Both versions of the game are a hit, with both players and critics alike, despite the heavy use of distance fog in the Nintendo 64 version of the game and some graphical glitches in the PC version. Rogue Squadron was a definitive Star Wars game for years to come, proving that the high standards of the franchise had not dropped, and gamers were once again reassured that playing a Star Wars game meant playing through a high quality experience in all regards. 1997 and 98 were the last years in which the world knew of only 3 Star Wars films. From 99 onwards, the release of the prequel trilogy changed the Star Wars gaming landscape permanently. The end of 1998 marked a high point of being a Star Wars fan. The games released were of generally high quality, and the future promised not only a new movie, but many more games too. Tune in next time to find out if that hope was rewarded as we take a look at a new generation.